Good morning. So today will be the last week of this little unit on the how the biblical authors addressed uh, Greek philosophical ideas and so on. Just as a little bit of review, we talked about this term last week, the logos, which was a word with a lot of meanings of message, logic, reason, and so on, but it was particularly used in Greek philosophy to mean like some force of reason, but then it was picked up by Hellenized Jews. We mentioned that in Alexandria, Egypt, there were a lot of Jews who Greek became their primary language. They translated the Old Testament into Greek, which was useful. But they also picked up on a lot of Greek philosophical ideas, and some of them didn't really mix too well with Judaism. And in particular, Philo of Alexandria was a writer from about the time of Christ, 25 BC to 50 AD, and he personified, so instead of some impersonal force of reason in the universe, the logos he adapted from some of the Plato's philosophy was a being who was a go-between between the Creator, the ultimate God, and mankind. And he tried to adapt that to Judaism. So he tried to hypothesize in his writings, and so did other Alexandrian Jews, like the unknown author of The Wisdom of Solomon, which is an apocryphal book, tried to take the Old Testament God and mankind and hypothesize some sort of intermediary, referred to as the Logos, but he wasn't consistent. Sometimes he said patriarchs like Abraham or Moses, sometimes figures like Melchizedek, sometimes the current high priest was referred to as the Logos, angels. And you know, when you think about them, that would make, all of those would make sense. In some way, they do communicate between God and man, whether it's the high priest or angels or whatever. Now, we talked about the Gospel of John last week, where the word logos is used explicitly in chapter 1, translated into English as word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we said it seems like what John was doing was saying, you're looking for some sort of intermediary between God and man? Well, there is already one, the incarnation of the Son of God, and it's superior to any intermediary that you're dreaming up because it's not a created being. The Logos goes back to in the beginning, coexisting with the Creator God, and is fully equal with God, as in the doctrine of the Trinity. And so John is asserting the superiority of Jesus Christ, the incarnation of the Son of God, within the concept of the Trinity, to any Logos that they might have heard of or been taught about. And it's my thesis today, drawing upon some classical scholars, that even though the book of Hebrews doesn't use the word logos, that the book of Hebrews is actually a very lengthy version of what John was saying in chapter 1, that Jesus Christ is superior to any intermediaries that you could possibly have. And so even though the word doesn't appear, a lot of scholars who are familiar with these Alexandrian Jews, these Hellenistic Jews, with Philo and the Wisdom of Solomon and so on, read the book of Hebrews and said, boy, this sounds awfully familiar. From particular words and phrases to the concepts being addressed. And so in the 20th century, a lot of classical scholars started to say, this seems to be a response to these Jews who mixed Greek philosophy in with their religion. And like John chapter 1, the theme is Jesus Christ is superior to all these other conceptions of a logos, a mediator between God and man. So let's look at what the Alexandrian Jews taught about the logos. They had all these candidates, like patriarchs, like Abraham and Moses, in different writings. Melchizedek, that's a mysterious figure to us, and we'll get into that in detail here in just a minute. Angels, natural go-between between God and man. Prophets, another natural message from God to man would be through prophets. But of course also the laws and covenants through Abraham and Moses. So these all fit. And then of course the current high priest is at any one moment someone who stands before God on the Jews' behalf and so on. So he occurred to them as an example of a go-between, a mediator between God and man. But when you have that list in mind, as the scholars who are familiar with the Alexandrian Jews did, and then you go look at the outline of the first 9.5 chapters of Hebrews, there's a tremendous similarity, because if we outline the book of Hebrews, the first 4 verses establish that Jesus is superior to the prophets. And then a chapter and a half is that Jesus is superior to angels. And then we have 6 verses here that Jesus is superior to Moses. What is this list starting to sound like? Prophets, Moses, angels. This is the list of what the Alexandrian Jews came up with as the mediator between God and man. Then there's a digression in which the author of Hebrews warns his readers against slipping back into unbelief. And then he resumes with a very lengthy section that goes on to the middle of chapter 10, that Jesus is superior to the high priest. Now, most of your study Bibles will say that the point of the book of Hebrews is to tell Jews, don't go back to your old religion, especially in a time of persecution or something. You've got something superior now to it. But I think there's something more specific. I think Alexandrian Jews are being addressed, not just all Hebrews. And they're being told, don't go back to your old conception of how God communicates to mankind. Don't go back to your old conceptions of the mediator between God and man, because you've got something superior to all that stuff that you grabbed from Greek philosophy. You've got Jesus Christ, who's a superior mediator, a superior logos. This list right here from the outline of Hebrews is exactly like the list from the previous slide. And as kind of a subtopic in Hebrews chapter 7, within that big section about how Jesus is superior to the high priest, there's a kind of a digression here about this mysterious character Melchizedek, and about how the new priesthood of Jesus Christ is superior to the Jewish high priest in the same way that the priesthood of Melchizedek was superior. So, what about Melchizedek? He kind of mysteriously appears in Genesis chapter 14. Abram, before he was Abraham, led the rescue of his relative Lot in a military alliance that was formed on the spur of the moment after the people who Lot and his family had gone off to live in what was Sodom. and he was captured. There lots of people were carried off, and they were rescued by a group of armies led by Abram. And after the victory, Abram offered a tenth of the spoils of war to Melchizedek, who showed up. And Melchizedek was identified as king of Salem. Later, Salem is called Jerusalem. In addition to being a priest, so somehow he's accepted, we don't have any background on him, he's accepted by God as a priest, and he's a king. I don't know. Then he would have to survive through the flood, or what? I'm not sure about that. But Melchizedek kind of disappears from any more reference in the Bible until you get to a messianic psalm, Psalm 110, and we looked at this briefly, and it's quoted in the book of Hebrews. But when I studied in the fall the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, Psalm 110, the first few verses, begins with a famous line that's quoted by Jesus concerning his own Messiah nature. The Lord declared to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Now Jesus quoted that and said to some of the crowds who were questioning him, why did David say, you called the Messiah the son of David? But David referred to him as my Lord. And there's obviously three people involved here. The Lord declared to my Lord. Who's that? How did David refer to the Messiah as my Lord if he's just the son of David? In other words, if he's just a man who's descended from David, why would David call him my Lord? And the people had no answer for Jesus. They were amazed and they were thinking about it, but they had no answer. And the psalm continues, the Lord will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, rule over your surrounding enemies. Your people will volunteer on your day of battle. In holy splendor, from the womb of the dawn, the dew of your youth belongs to you. And then here's a verse that's quoted a couple of times in Hebrews. The Lord has sworn an oath and will not take it back. Forever you are a priest like Melchizedek. So there's a messianic prophecy that the Messiah will be a priest like Melchizedek. And it's often translated after the order of Melchizedek. But what the Hebrew means is in the same manner, in the manner of Melchizedek, like Melchizedek. Well, what does that mean? Well, Melchizedek, there's two distinguishing things here. First of all, Melchizedek was not a priest because he was descended from somebody. It's not because, like if you're from the tribe of Levi and you're a priest, or you're descended from Aaron, who's from the tribe of Levi. We don't have any background information on Melchizedek. And Levi didn't exist yet. This is centuries before Levi was born. And so he didn't get the priesthood by being born into it, being descended from anyone. And furthermore, he was also a king. Now, this is something we talked about in the Messianic prophecy study that the Jews had a hard time with. There are Messianic passages that say the Messiah will be a new high priest. But there are Messianic passages that say he'll be the new king. Now, in the law of Moses, the kings descended from David were therefore from the tribe of Judah, which is David's tribe. But priests all had to be from the tribe of Levi. So how could the Messiah someday be both a new king and a new priest when they come from different tribes? And that caused the Jews to think, maybe these aren't just one person. Maybe when the Messiah comes, he's got a helper who's the new high priest. Maybe it's not one person. And so on. And they also, of course, had a hard time with the idea that there's a suffering servant who has to die. How can this victorious king be the suffering servant who has to die for all the people? Well, maybe that's another person. So maybe it's not all one. Maybe it's like three people, the Messiah. The Messiah and his two helpers, or something like that. It was very confusing to them. But what we have here is a teaching that this transcends the law of Moses. Melchizedek goes back before the law of Moses. There's no particular reason you can't be king and priest before that time. And Jesus Christ, the Messiah, is going to transcend the law of Moses. It's going to be a new covenant. The boundaries established by that old covenant don't have to be followed. Okay? So, in the manner of Melchizedek, the Messiah will be. How's that? Well, he'll be king and priest, and not because he was born to be a priest, not because he's descended from Levi or something. So, just as one last idea here, if you, once again, you read your study Bibles and say, okay, who wrote Hebrews? The author doesn't identify himself. It just starts in. Now, there are certain theological concepts and phrases that appear in a few places that are reminiscent of Paul. And so a lot of people say, well, maybe Paul wrote Hebrews. Well, but Paul always identifies himself in every other book that he wrote. He starts out saying, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, to the church at Corinth or whatever. So it would be very odd for this to be Paul. Those who study Greek in detail will say it just doesn't look like Paul, honestly. It doesn't look like his writing. However, there is that influence from Paul. There's agreement with some of Paul's phrases and concepts. Like the theme that there's one mediator. And Paul, when writing to Timothy, said there is one mediator between God and man, Christ Jesus. And that's a theme in Hebrews. So there's a lot of things here that are very reminiscent of Paul. And when you look at how the early church discussed what books would be in the canon of the New Testament, they wanted apostolic authority for a book, but that doesn't mean it had to be written by an apostle. An apostle could be behind it. For example, the Gospel of Mark is Mark recording the gospel preaching of Peter. Mark's not an apostle, but Peter's an apostle. Luke wrote Luke and Acts under the authority of Paul. He worked with Paul. So it's reasonable to say that Paul commissioned someone to write the book of Hebrews, someone who's familiar with Paul and who picks up on a couple of phrases of Paul, is compatible with the teachings of Paul, but isn't Paul himself. So who would it be? Well, whoever wrote it is very educated and articulate and persuasive. It's at a certain level of Greek grammar and so on, to where, this is someone who's highly educated and an associate of Paul. Well, that narrows it down somewhat, but there's still quite a few choices. Among the associates of Paul that we have some good inference are educated, literate, articulate, persuasive men. Barnabas and Silas and Mark and Luke are all candidates. But let's add one more criterion. This is someone who needs to be familiar with all this Alexandrian Jewish teaching that he's responding to. So what we really would think would be the best candidate for the author of Hebrews would be someone who has all of these criteria, an associate of Paul, educated, articulate, and so on. And so one candidate does kind of jump out to, not just to me, but to many scholars who've studied this. Acts chapter 18, verse 24, a new character is introduced. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. Luke thought it was worth noting that he came from Alexandria. Came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. And Apollos is described as being very persuasive, and the controversy arose that's addressed in 1 Corinthians, that some in Corinth were saying, well, I studied from Paul, and others, I studied under Apollos. I was baptized by him, and so on. So apparently Apollos was a great teacher, but more importantly, he was someone who was a Jew from Alexandria, and it was common for people back in the Roman Empire to have a Jewish name if they were Jews, and a Greek name. And he goes by his Greek name, Apollos, but he's a Jew from Alexandria. So he's straddling this world. He's a Christian who came from a background of being an Alexandrian Jew. And so he understands all of this weird mixture of Greek philosophy and Judaism that happened in Alexandria. And so he's kind of the perfect candidate for Paul to say, after discussing it with him, write about this. Write about the superiority of Jesus Christ to all that stuff. And so I think that's what most of the book of Hebrews is. So how does it apply to us today? I mean, that's all kind of esoteric. We don't live in a world of Alexandrian Jews who have mixed Greek philosophy in. But like I said last time about the Logos, all human beings feel this gulf, this distance between us and God that needs to be bridged by some mediator. We have to get in touch with God somehow. And the thing that we should appreciate, therefore, is that God recognized that, and God sent us the perfect mediator, Jesus Christ. And God gives us what we need to be in touch with him. I think I mentioned last time, if you didn't have Jesus Christ and someone asked you, how do you picture God? Well, we've got these pictures going back to childhood of this great big man in the sky with a white beard and so on. We know that this isn't accurate, but what do you picture? What do you, how do you get in touch with God? But I can picture Jesus of Nazareth. I can picture him walking around and teaching, doing miracles, being crucified, resurrected. That puts me in touch with God in a way that nothing else could. And so we have the superior mediator between God and man. We have something that no other religion or philosophy has ever had. We actually have contact with the incarnation of God. Not just some inferior mediator that was created later, not just an angel or something. We have something superior to anything else in this world. And that's part of the meaning of the book of Hebrews. And so the author of Hebrews exhorts those Jews, don't go back to the old inferior concepts. You've got something better. And that's what we have. All right. Thank you. We'll take a look at a gospel topic starting next week. Thank you. Oh, thank you. How are you doing? Yeah, still taking 29 pills?